There is a documented pattern in how wealth actually transfers between generations, and it has almost nothing to do with what gets covered in financial media. Researchers who study private business ownership have identified a specific cluster of industries where operators quietly accumulate capital at rates that outperform nearly every other category of small business investment. These aren't new industries, they aren't tech-adjacent, they aren't being disrupted. And the people building serious wealth inside them are not talking about it because the businesses themselves are so structurally unglamorous that attention would only invite the one thing that's been absent long enough to become their biggest advantage. Every decade, without exception, a new class of millionaires emerges quietly, not from venture-backed startups, not from cryptocurrency cycles, not from building an audience online. They come from the same 6 business categories, repeated across generations, repeated across geographies, repeated across economic conditions. This isn't a theory built on optimism. It's pattern recognition drawn from business sale records, IRS income data, and franchise performance reports spanning decades. The baseline fact is this: roughly 90% of new businesses fail within the first 10 years. These 6 categories invert that statistic almost entirely, and the reason why is not complicated, but it is hiding in a place most people refuse to look. Here is what makes that uncomfortable. The businesses with the highest documented success rates are also the ones that educated, ambitious people spend the least time considering. Studies on entrepreneurial research behavior consistently show that the average person invests over 200 hours evaluating a business idea before committing, and almost none of that time lands anywhere near these 6 categories. Not because the numbers aren't there, the numbers are very much there, but because these businesses carry no social currency. Nobody posts about them. They don't appear in startup media. They don't generate admiration at dinner parties. And so smart people, people who have done the research, people who are serious about building wealth, systematically overlook them. That pattern is worth sitting with for a moment, because if success rate correlates with obscurity, then the filter most people are using to evaluate opportunity is quietly working against them. The entrepreneurial culture most of us absorbed over the last 2 decades was built around a specific set of values: disruption, innovation, rapid scale. The idea that a good business is one that changes something, that it replaces an old system with something faster, smarter, more efficient. That framing is not wrong exactly, but it is dangerously incomplete. When you cross-reference it against actual small business survival data broken down by sector, a different picture emerges. The businesses that survive aren't the ones that disrupted something. They're the ones that served something that never went away. Recurring demand, low operational complexity, the ability to scale without scaling the founder's time proportionally. That is the actual formula, not a motivational framework, a structural one. These 6 businesses didn't outlast their competitors because their founders were more talented. They outlasted them because the model itself was built on needs that cannot be disrupted away. And here is the contradiction that most ambitious people never fully resolve. High aspiration paired with high business complexity produces the highest failure rates we have on record. Low aspiration paired with low complexity produces something closer to the opposite. The less exciting the model, the more predictable the cash flow. The more predictable the cash flow, the more reliably it compounds. And compounding, not excitement, is what converts a business into lasting wealth. This is not an argument for thinking small. It is an argument for thinking structurally. There is nothing small about building a business that generates consistent, defensible, recurring income for 15 years. That is, mathematically, one of the most powerful financial positions a person can occupy. What we are going to do in this video is go through each of these 6 categories, not just by naming them, but by examining the structural architecture underneath each one. The margin mechanics, the demand floor, the scalability ceiling, and the wealth pattern that emerges when an operator stays patient long enough to let the model work. By the end, you will have a framework you can apply to any business idea you encounter, not just these 6. And one note before we begin. The 4th category on this list is the one most people dismiss immediately and find themselves reconsidering seriously several months later. Keep that in mind as we move through. The first category operates entirely below the glamour line: essential utility services. Businesses like waste removal, septic maintenance, water treatment supply, and environmental services. These are businesses that exist because civic and residential life cannot function without them. That is not a marketing claim, it is infrastructure reality. The demand floor is not driven by consumer preference or economic mood. It is driven by the fact that homes, buildings, and municipalities have non-negotiable operational requirements that repeat on a schedule, regardless of what the economy is doing. What this creates, from a business perspective, is a service contract environment with low customer acquisition friction and extremely high retention. The margins in these businesses are not spectacular in any single transaction, but they are consistent, they are defensible, and because the perceived attractiveness of the category is low, the competitive landscape is structurally thin. Operators who are willing to work below the glamour line get rewarded with something more valuable than admiration. They get pricing power, long-term contracts, and very little pressure from new entrants who would rather build something that looks better on a LinkedIn profile. The wealth pattern in this category is quiet and durable. Owners rarely get press, but they receive checks, monthly, reliably, for decades. The second category involves the monetization of physical space, not in the way that most people associate with real estate investing, but in a more asset-efficient form. Self-storage facilities, commercial overflow space, transitional industrial use. The core of this model is that once the infrastructure is deployed, the variable cost structure is nearly flat. Revenue scales with units occupied, not with headcount, not with operational complexity. The demand floor here is driven by urbanization and the consumption patterns of modern life. People accumulate more than their primary living spaces can hold. Businesses expand before they can secure permanent space. Both create recurring, price-inelastic demand for physical overflow capacity. The average profit margin in established self-storage operations sits between 40% and 50%, a figure that most traditional businesses would consider implausible. The scalability path runs from single-location ownership to multi-site portfolio to potential REIT conversion. Operators who enter this category and remain patient, who resist the urge to optimize for excitement rather than compounding, tend to look, 15 years in, like people who made very obvious decisions in hindsight. They didn't. They made structurally sound ones. The third category is built on the principle that the most efficient deployment of capital is one that converts a single investment into recurring revenue without requiring proportional time. Automated product and service delivery, route-based businesses, location-based vending operations, distribution networks tied to daily behavioral patterns. The mechanism is simple. You deploy an asset, that asset generates revenue on a schedule, and you reinvest the margin into additional assets. The compounding loop is not metaphorical here, it is mechanical. The first unit of capital deployed is the hardest. The 10th is easier. The 100th is nearly self-funding. What most people misread about this category is that they evaluate it as a labor business, something that requires physical effort to maintain and therefore scales poorly. The operators who build serious wealth here see it differently. They see it as a systems design problem. Once the logistics, restocking, monitoring, and routing are systematized, the business scales through deployment of capital rather than deployment of time. The first million comes slowly. The second arrives faster. The third often comes from selling the system to someone who wants to skip the early phase entirely. The fourth category is the one that deserves a moment of honest acknowledgement. Event and construction support services, specifically portable sanitation and temporary facility management. Every construction site, every outdoor event, every public gathering of scale requires temporary sanitation infrastructure. The demand is contractual, recurring, and largely indifferent to economic cycles. Construction slows in recessions but does not stop. Events compress but do not disappear. The margin structure in this category is among the highest of any asset-based service business. Operators with established fleets report profit margins in the range of 50% to 60%. The scalability path runs from independent fleet ownership to regional contracts to, in many markets, a near monopoly position simply by being the only serious operator willing to operate in the space. The psychological barrier to entry is real. Most people will not pursue this category because it conflicts with how they want to perceive themselves professionally. That barrier is not a problem for the people who can think past it. It is, structurally, the entire competitive advantage. The moat here is not technology, not intellectual property, not network effects. It is the fact that most people with capital and competence would rather deploy it somewhere that feels better. That preference is worth money to the operators who don't share it. That preference is worth money to the operators who don't share it. The fifth category is what happens when you reduce a business to its most essential element: urban land and space arbitrage, parking facilities, storage lots, transitional land use. The model here is not complex. You hold a piece of geography that other people need temporary access to, and you charge for that access. There is no inventory, there is no manufacturing, there is no service delivery complexity. Revenue is a function of location and occupancy rates. The demand floor is driven by vehicle density, urban density, and the spatial constraints that come with both. The competitive landscape in this category is shaped by one primary factor: the high upfront cost of acquiring well-located land. For operators who can clear that threshold, the return structure is one of the most durable in private business. You are not building something that can be disrupted. You are holding something that can't be moved. The wealth pattern here is nearly invisible from the outside, which is part of why it persists. Owners in this category rarely need to market, build a brand, or compete on anything other than location. The asset does the work indefinitely. The sixth category may be the most structurally elegant of them all: property and asset management, the business of managing other people's real estate for a recurring fee. The capital requirement to enter this model is among the lowest of any scalable business. You own nothing. You control the relationship between the asset owner and the operational complexity they don't want to manage, and you earn a percentage of monthly revenue for providing that separation. At 10% management fees across a portfolio of 200 properties averaging $1,500 per month in rent, the monthly revenue flowing through the business is $300,000. Your cut is $30,000 per month. Your expenses are a small team and software. The scalability dynamic here is asymmetric in a way that most businesses are not. Doubling the portfolio does not double the operational complexity. It might increase it by 20%. The margin expansion as you scale is structural, not dependent on luck or market conditions. And the demand floor is permanent. As long as there are landlords who would rather receive a check than manage a tenant, there is a market for this business. That condition is not changing. Now, it is worth stepping back and identifying what these six categories share, because that structural commonality is the actual framework this video is built around. Each of these businesses has a demand floor that is non-discretionary or near non-discretionary. Each has a complexity ceiling low enough to be systematized and delegated without requiring the founder's constant presence. Each exhibits inelastic customer behavior, the kind that persists through recessions, inflation cycles, and market corrections. Each carries a high barrier to entry that is psychological rather than financial, which means it self-selects for operators who can think past perception. And each is built on an asset or route-based revenue model, where income is tied to deployment of capital, not deployment of time. When you find a business that scores well across all 5 of those criteria, you are not looking at an exciting opportunity. You are looking at a structural one. And structural is better. If you are sitting with capital somewhere between $50,000 and $500,000 and considering how to deploy it, the first question is not which of these categories is most interesting. It is which has the lowest operator density in your specific geography. Because the margin advantage in these businesses compounds faster in underserved markets. The second thing worth understanding is that acquisition of an existing operation in any of these categories almost always outperforms building from scratch. Roughly 70% of small businesses in these sectors have no formal succession plan. Owners approaching retirement are often motivated sellers with built-in proof of concept, existing customer relationships, and operational infrastructure already in place. You are not buying a business so much as buying a compounding machine that someone else assembled. If you are working with less than $50,000, the entry path shifts toward lower capital intensity models, management-based structures, route acquisition, proof of concept phase before geographic expansion. The principle remains the same. Deploy what you have, prove the model in one location, reinvest the margin aggressively in the first 2 years. The compounding window is most powerful at the beginning. The deepest reframe this video is trying to offer is this. Boring is not a description of quality. It is a description of competitive position. When a business model is too unglamorous to attract aspirational capital, the operators who are willing to enter it inherit the margins that competition would otherwise compress. The 90% success rate attached to these 6 categories is not a coincidence. It is the mathematical result of low competition, recurring demand, and operators who chose to optimize for compounding rather than perception. Every year spent searching for a more exciting alternative is a year of compounding that someone else is collecting. The question is not whether these models work. The data on that is settled. The question is whether you are willing to let go of the version of entrepreneurship you were sold, the one that requires a good story, and replace it with one that requires a good structure. If this kind of thinking resonates with you, if you found yourself recalibrating something while you watch this, then you are exactly who this channel is built for. This is Nick Finance, and what we do here is not financial entertainment, it is financial reconstruction. We take the frameworks that most people never encounter because they are not glamorous enough to trend, and we lay them out clearly, without noise, without urgency, and without the performance that passes for insight in most financial content. The next video on this channel will walk through exactly how to identify, evaluate, and acquire an existing boring business for under 6 figures, without a broker, without an intermediary, and without the inflated valuations that come from buying through traditional channels. If you have ever considered owning a business but felt the gap between where you are and where you would need to be was too wide, that video is designed specifically to close that gap. Subscribe so you see it when it goes live. And if this video gave you one idea worth keeping, leave a comment with which of the 6 categories you would enter first given your current position. Not the most exciting one, the one that makes the most structural sense for where you are right now. That distinction between what is exciting and what is structural